Welcome to Philosophy15. I'm Scott Aikin.
I'm Robert Talisse.
And we're two philosophy professors talking about philosophy 15 minutes at a clip, unscripted, whatever we've been thinking about recently, whatever we're thinking about right now. We're the authors of Why We Argue and How We Should, A Guide to Political Disagreement in an Age of Unreason. And
we don't even have it yet, but we have a photo of somebody holding, I don't know if you can see it, a book that we just published called Political Argument in a Polarized Age, Reason and Democratic Life.
And one of the puzzles that we address in both of the books, but in with a good deal of focus in the Political Argument in a Polarized Age book, is the intersection of really two phenomena. One, the phenomenon of hoping that we are civil with each other, but also the related phenomena, or maybe sort of contrary phenomenon, of political polarization. And Rob has seen that these two phenomena have an interesting connection. So, Rob, tell us about the connection and the sort of a puzzle about civility and polarization.
Sure. So, I guess the first thing to clarify maybe is that given what a democratic society is, right, self-government among equals, when you've got equals, you're going to have political disagreement. When you've got political disagreement, that's political disagreement. You're going to have disagreement over important stuff like justice. And so democracy is fundamentally a political order that runs on disagreement among equals. Because it's disagreement among equals, there are certain kinds of moral requirements that accrue to us in virtue of the fact that we're citizens. And so there's a certain standard of conduct that we have to try to satisfy, or maybe we even have to satisfy it if we're going to behave well as democratic citizens. So what that means is that if civility is a requirement of democratic citizenship, it seems natural to think that whatever civility is, it's going to be a requirement of that kind. Civility can't be simply a matter of the tone of your voice or the volume of your voice or how heated you're getting, because after all, arguments about the most important stuff should be exercised in those ways.
Our norms of argument should allow us to be adamant, right? To be adamant, to be exercised, to be to really be full of the kind of vigor that's necessary for us to live up to those things, and even to live up to our conscience with regards to it.
Good. And add to that the sort of separate point, but point in the same direction. Norms of politeness and calmness and reservedness and concessiveness, when those are in play in a discourse about justice and injustice among people who may not be equally situated, those norms actually just wind up being instruments for deflecting criticism, silencing critics, excluding people from the process altogether. So
some forms of the norms of civility then are really norms that are in the service of the status quo. And as a consequence have got downstream political problems with them. So reconceiving the norms of civility so that they don't have those defaults those ways is necessary.
That's right. So in the way that I think it's best to reconceive the norms is that civility is not a norm of politeness or concessiveness or reservedness or even cooperativeness. Civility is instead the norm to, or the set of dispositions, or the requirement to, let's say, put it that way, to avoid unnecessary escalation, unwarranted heat, undue aggression. That is, it looks like if civility is going to be a requirement for democratic, or a virtue of democratic citizens, that is going to be consistent with the democracy part, we've got to thicken up the concept a little bit. So it's not just the volume of your voice, it's the appropriateness of that volume. It's not just the spiciness or the tone that you're taking, it's the appropriateness of that tone.
Let's pause and appreciate some features of this requirement. which is that the appropriateness is going to, in some ways, already have an eye of the beholder problem.
That's right.
Because, for example, if I think that this is an unfounded political program, and you think that it is something about the justice of the society hinges on this, we're going to judge the heat with which you pose these sorts of things through very different lenses of being able to identify the appropriateness. So that's, you might say, a kind of a puzzle number one, which is, given the disagreement over the values, the level of appropriateness is itself going to be something that's in contention.
That's right. So, and that's really where I think the crux of the problem lies, in that, we might think, when you thicken up the concept of civility so that it's about the appropriateness or warrantedness of heat and spice and tone and adversariality, you might say, okay, well, we still have a lot of work to do. We've got to figure out, right, how to gauge the right level of the level of appropriateness of adversariality. Let's just say very generally. Right. So that's one kind of problem, right? That, okay, we've got a problem that we've got to figure out how to evaluate what is an appropriate level, or what makes for an appropriate level of, tone and spice and sharpness and animosity. And
notice, by the way, that there are ways to sort of do this, but that requires, in some ways, for us to be able to inhabit the other side's perspective.
That's right.
So if I'd said something like, "Look, in order for me to say, look, I disagree with you, and I think that this is incorrect." Moreover, I think that it's incorrect from your own perspective.
That's right.
Being able to take up the perspective of the other side and say, okay, look, I see that they're living by the courage of their convictions, and that's represented with the way that they're putting it. I think they're wrong about it, but I understand why they're doing it, because I see the point that they've got, and I can then understand, you might say, the affect that they have with regards to how they pose it. But that requires a prior level of just a basic understanding. That's for right. You to be able to identify that, you might say, conditionally.
That's right. And so we've already sort of implicitly indicated that there's a distinction between what we might say the armchair task of figuring out how to gauge the level of appropriateness, and the in situ task, right? When you're actually engaged in political disagreement.
Right. There's no set where it's a priori I know exactly how this is going to look. You say, well, no, it turns out that there are conditions under these discussions. Okay.
That's right. So that's a different kind of task, and it's much more difficult. And in fact, even if you could settle the more theoretical or armchairy question, right. What is an appropriate, what makes for an appropriate level of animosity or adversariality, you still have the problem of when we're engaged in political discourse, the norm of civility is supposed to be the kind of thing we can avail ourselves of as contestants, or as people engaged in political disagreement. Right. And so even if we could settle the theoretical task, we're still going to have to deploy the concept in the middle of contexts of adversariality. Right. Now, and that's going to be very difficult. But here's the real kicker. Civility, if we could figure it out, all of the details, civility is going to be a reciprocal requirement. It might be a good idea to be civil unilaterally in certain kinds of contexts. It might make you a good person to be civil unilaterally, right? But if it's thinking of it strictly as a requirement of citizenship, thinking it simply as a kind of thing that if you're not civil, you're criticizable qua citizen, it looks like it's got to be a reciprocal requirement. That is, you are required to be civil so long as the others are upholding the requirement, or look like they can be counted on to uphold the requirement. Right. So you don't owe, as a citizen, you don't owe, or you're not required to be civil in response to interlocutors who are violating whatever civility's requirements are.
Because now you're playing a different game.
That's right. Good.
Right. Now we're playing the game of airing our grievances, or just trying to hurt each other's feelings, or chasing
each other out.
Yeah, right.
That's right.
The shutdown, right? The owned.
That's right.
Okay, right. We're playing the owned game instead of the argument game.
Yeah, in a slightly different context, we would roll out the Rawlsian distinction between the two kinds of rules to make this point, right? Okay, but we don't need to do that. So, civility is a matter of motives and dispositions and things internal, rather than sort of brutally observable parts of our behavior. That means that When we are engaged in argument, in calling one another out on incivility, we are in effect making a judgment about one another's motives and intentions. In order to be a good judge of when our interlocutors are being civil or uncivil, we need to be able to be charitable in interpreting one another's motives and dispositions in the heat of political debate. And it turns out that we're really bad at doing that because we're really bad at being charitable
to views we hate.
Yeah, and the people who espouse them.
Even worse.
Yeah, we over ascribe negative character traits, unsavory motives,
right,
suspicious intentions to people who we perceive to be our political opponents, which means more and more of what they do is going to look to us as uncivil.
Yeah.
And by the way, there is a sense in which, perhaps with some let's just say, not unjustifiably, right? It's not like...
Well, that's the other part of it, is that, like, because of the interpretive situation, it looks like you do have evidence, right? Like, by your best lights, that's evidence.
That's exactly right.
Of the fact that they are cheaters in the game of giving and asking for reasons.
That's right. So you are subjectively justified in holding, in seeing the other side as poorly motivated.
And so once these demands of charity are no longer met, it looks like then you see the others as cheaters. You've got a long-standing set of evidence, right? You're like, yeah, it's like, look at the overwhelming tradition of these folks being folks who just sort of don't take up with us in the right kind of way. They're not right.
Failures,
right?
Or being rule breakers.
That's right.
They see you the same way.
That's exactly it.
And so, what do we get?
We get a kind of standoff of
everybody claims to be the person who's interested in upholding civility, and incivility escalates.
Right.
With justification.
That's the last part of it. That at least in the application, it looks like there's no error that's happening. Nobody's intentionally doing anything wrong.
Well, it's
They're not
blameless.
slipping. It's a kind of intellectually blameless errers.
That's right.
Right.
So,
but but we can only see that from well outside, right?
That's right.
You can't see it from the first person because it looks like you're just responding
to the evidence
that you've got, which is that they are cheaters.
That's right. Good.
Okay.
So there's a bleak upshot, and then there's it's still bleak but more theoretical upshot, right? Which certainly is let's start with the more theoretical upshot. It looks like what follows from this sort of quasi-prisoner dilemma kind of sort of setup, right, is that pundits and commentators who call for civility, we just have to be civil, is kind of like the guy just saying, do the right thing.
It's very informative.
Yeah. It's like, yeah, well, of course, everybody wants civility. We're all committed to civility.
Right.
That's not the problem. The problem is that we're all committed to civility, but we're incapable of trusting the other side's motives and intentions.
The calls for civility are usually in the second and third person.
Good, right. You're calling for the other people to be civil.
I'm making the call for civility, so that of course shows that I'm the civil one.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes.
And I would be civil if had you not started it.
Right. That's the other one.
So that's the other way. So it looks like just calls for civility are inert. Right.
And in fact, maybe so. Well, here's the crucial thing: is that in fact they are right. They're inert in one way. They're not informative, but they're informative. They're not informative about like what particular things that need to be done. They are informative about, you might say, the double-mindedness.
That's right.
That we've got under these conditions. That we all nevertheless see ourselves. So there's sort of good news amidst the bad news. Right. We're all still committed to, and in fact, part of the escalation of the circumstances is because of the fact that we're committed to the civility, right? So there's the good news amidst the bad news is that we are committed to it, but we're in an interpretive situation that we can't see the other side as also committed. We constantly see them and interpret them through this lens of suspicion.
That's right.
How's this crazy thing?
How do I shut this thing off? Philosophy 15, folks. See you next time.